Jesus freak here. The topic came up elsewhere, so I thought I'd bring it up. Probably about 150, 200 at the most years before the Christian era, Greek-speaking Jews started translating their scriptures so that they had them in their own language. There was a similar process going on in Syriac where they created some extremely wild paraphrastic translations into Syriac, which were called the Targumim. And these were not hardly translations by any sense of the word. We're talking roughly the message level of translation from Hebrew into Syriac. That's what a Targum was. Now, they were working on translations into Greek. And it wasn't very coordinated. Just random people were doing translations of this part and that part. There was no quality control. Also, it wasn't a literal translation necessarily. It wasn't really a paraphrase either. But, they there were places where it got a little bit wild. Also, they weren't working from the standard text, which I'm sure existed even at that time, although it wasn't letter for letter what we have now. It was probably very close. But they were working from a very divergent text. Some people thought they were just translating poorly, but in the 40s we found a bunch of Hebrew manuscripts that actually had some of the same readings that the Greek manuscripts did. So we were able to make a new conclusion. It wasn't necessarily that the translations were bad, although they were. They weren't based on the same Hebrew. But somehow, in the early Christian era, where Greek was supplanting Hebrew and Syriac as the main languages used among Christians, people actually thought the Greek translation of the Old Testament was inspired. To the point that when Jerome sat down and said, I'm not going to finish this translation of the Old Testament from Greek I was working on, he finished Psalms at least, I'm going to go from Hebrew. He actually got a lot of criticism for that. But if you look at the Vulgate, if you look at a translation of the Vulgate, it's actually pretty close to what we have now. There's not that much difference in readings between a translation of the Vulgate and a translation of the Masoretic text. The main issue, of course, is the Vulgates evolved over time because of the Church of Rome. The Vulgate was also occasionally much more literal, sometimes to the point that you actually had issues because it was too literal. Now, the Vulgate wasn't translated exactly from the Masoretic text either. There were places where the Vulgate had a divergent reading that was based on some different Hebrew source. I'll give you one example. It's probably one of the better known ones. Let's see where I have Bible in my reach. Here we go. One particular difference can be found in Genesis 4:8. The King James is translated strictly from Masoretic here, and it'll say, "And Cain talked with Abel his brother. It came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him." Now, pull up this Challoner Old Testament here. Bunch of Church of Rome junk here. Look for the same verse in Challoner, which translates the Vulgate. It says, "And Cain said to Abel his brother, Let us go forth abroad. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and slew him." And it turns out that a lot of translations from around that time period had some similar expression there. However, it's not in the current Hebrew text. And this is an example of one, it's one of the few places there's really any big difference between, any place where we could say, we might be able to find something a little bit that improved. And it's not, it's no major difference, It's not any theologically important point, it's not like the so-called angry Jesus of Mark 1 or anything like that. It's just a few words of incidental dialogue. It doesn't matter if the word's there or not. We still have the whole message. And most of the divergences between the Vorlage of the Hebrew text that was used as the basis of the Vulgate and the Masoretic text, which is the Vorlage of the King James, for the most part. I get back to that. It's mostly incidental stuff that doesn't really affect anything. There are a couple places where the interpretation that was current in the Greek manuscripts was utilized. And yes, it was possible to understand the Hebrew in that way. It's not what the Hebrews said, but it's how people that time would have understood it. One particular example, I guess, is Psalm 8:5. To get an alternative understanding, I have a Revised Standard Version, and I'm going to explain my use of it here. In this verse, the RSV is literally translating Hebrew. And it reads, "Yet thou hast made him little less than God, and dost crown him with glory and honor. Thou hast given him dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet." Now, there's a valid reason why the King James opted to use the Greek reading. The King James here reads, "For thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honor. Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet." And the reason for this is Paul quotes Psalm 8 in his letter to the Hebrews. And that's exactly the way he words it. Let me pages don't feel like I'm used to. A little bit thick, and I'm turning long. Okay, it's Hebrews 2, 7, and 8a. "Thou madest him a little lower than the angels. Thou crownedst him with glory and honor, and didst to set him over the works of thy hands. Thou put all things in subjection under his feet." He was relying on what the Greek texts of his day said. Now, this may have well been, his amanuensis was taken down from whatever he had at hand. And he was writing in Greek. Certainly, Paul could have written in Hebrew or Syriac if he wanted to. Here, Paul is making a point that cannot be made from taking the Hebrew at its face value. But if you're working from the Greek, you can. And this may be why the Greek version lasted as long as it did in Christian circles. Eventually, of course, the Jews rejected it. They have a day to commemorate the translation of the Septuagint. It's a day of mourning, not a day of celebration. In their eyes, it was a disaster. Another place where the interpretation of the Greek was used, and in this case, it doesn't actually do violence to the Hebrew or anything. I mean, you're talking Elohim in the one case in Psalm 8. sometimes the King James does interpret it to mean human judges or angels or whatever, and that's, like I said, that's Greek influence. Another case is that a word meaning maiden was interpreted to mean virgin in Isaiah 7. A maiden naturally is going to be a virgin, so it's not really that big a deal. Of course, a lot of people are going to make a big production about that. But of course, when it's cited in Matthew 1, the word is unambiguously virgin. So, when the King James Version does, and they do, consult the Greek on occasion in the Old Testament, they do have valid reasons to do this. Even the Latin version did occasionally refer to the Greek, even though it didn't exactly take every approach that the Greek version did. Jerome could have said maiden in Isaiah 7. There were absolutely words he could have used. He chose a word, just as the Greek translators did, that meant virgin. And he didn't feel he was bound by the way the Greek people translated words and phrases. For example, there's a phrase that the Greek translators rendered the Lord Almighty. What was the phrase? What was the equivalent in English of the phrase Jerome used? It was the Lord of Hosts. So he didn't feel he was chained down by the Greek choice of words. He did very often spell names the same way they did. Of course, he sometimes felt that wasn't a good idea either. For example, the Septuagint spelled Joshua a certain way. And that resulted in a couple places in the New Testament where Joshua was being referred to as Jesus. It wasn't technically wrong, but Jerome decided to remove the ambiguity and he changed the spelling of Joshua's name to Josue, Josue, to avoid confusion with Jesus. And there were a few other names that Jerome spelled differently than if he were translating out of Greek. Now, for the most part, he did keep the same transcriptions. And that's why if, you look at an older Catholic Bible, you're going to notice the names are spelled different. Because they took the names as they were spelled in Latin. And the King James translators, when they translated the Old Testament, they anglicized the Hebrew names. They translated the New Testament, they just transcribed them out of Greek. So in the Old Testament, and yes, they had notes that tied the two together. You'll have, Elijah and Elisha in the Old Testament, And then in the New Testament, they're referred to as Elias and Eliseus. Did this confuse some people? Yes, it did. In fact, Joseph Smith actually interpreted Elias to mean someone different than Elijah. And he came up with this whole system about how Elias was somehow different than Elijah. Of course, he thought a whole bunch of weird, stupid things. This was a guy that supposedly he started digging in a hill in Palmyra, New York, and found a binder and wrote the book of Boney Maroney. The guy was. He claimed the inspiration of God. Clearly wasn't. You hear people talk about new revelation. There was no new revelation. Not from above. Anyway, just thought I'd talk a little bit about. There's more I could talk about on this subject too. This video is getting a bit long. Jesus, freak out.